November 30th, 1939. 4 Soviet armies with 21 divisions, more than 400,000 soldiers, thousands of tanks, warplanes, and heavy artillery cross Finland's borders. The invasion is almost 3 times larger than the Allied landing at Normandy on D-Day. The Winter War is an intense and bloody conflict, fought in unimaginable extremes of cold. It will change the course of the Second World War and then be virtually forgotten. An invader with overwhelming military superiority, a defender with little more than the will to resist, and the unintended consequences of war. It is a history ignored by nations at their own peril. Finland is a nation forged from conflict.
That was a total fight, because we felt that we are not safe anywhere, and our life is at stake, and our independence is at stake, and if we lose our independence, we are lost.
It was a struggle that attracted one young American to stake his life on a fight for freedom.
Never give up. Always fight for what is right. And they did.
Helsinki, Finland's capital city, has a population of more than 500,000. 300 years ago, Tsar Peter the Great founded a rival city just across the Gulf of Finland. St. Petersburg became the center of Russian Empire, and in 1917, the heart of a revolution. In 1924, it was renamed Leningrad to honor the first leader of the Soviet Union. Its population of 5 million is larger than the entire population of Finland. In 1939, Finland's border was only 40 kilometers away from Leningrad. Moving that border became a justification for war.
Comrades, soldiers of the Red Army, officers, commissars, and political workers, to fulfill the Soviet government's and our great fatherland's will, I hereby order the troops of Leningrad Military District to march over the frontier, crush the Finnish forces, and once and for all, secure the Soviet Union's northwestern borders and Lenin's city, the cradle of the revolution of the proletariat.
Soviet leader Joseph Stalin was confident of a quick victory. Most of his military agreed.
All we had to do was raise our voice a little bit, and the Finns would obey. If that didn't work, we could fire one shot, and the Finns would put up their hands and surrender. Or so we thought.
American Martha Gellhorn, one of the few international correspondents in Helsinki, witnessed the first bombers.
War started at 9 o'clock promptly. The people of Helsinki stood in the streets and listened to the painful rising and falling and always louder wail of the sirens. For the first time in history, they heard the sounds of bombs falling on their city. This is the modern way of declaring war.
The Red Army advanced quickly on all fronts. Finland's defenses seemed on the verge of collapse.
Their use of mass formations of tanks initially had a shattering effect on the Finns. They had never confronted a tank in training, and suddenly they look up out of their trenches and there's 50 of them rolling towards them with guns blazing.
The main thrust of the Russian offensive was through a narrow strip of land between Lake Ladoga and the Gulf of Finland called the Karelian Isthmus. Karelia was the childhood home of 11-year-old Eva Kelpie.
It was on the shore of a small lake, and if I close my eyes, I can imagine summer around it, and lilac bushes and the path that led to the place where we used to swim as a child. And in Karelia it was always warm and sunny. And of course we were happy. I used to pray to God. I asked him to prevent the war. And I remember that I carried the fear of war inside my child's heart.
First news of war came over the radio.
We didn't believe it. We thought that, well, it's not coming here. It's not coming to Hiitola. But when we were eating lunch, suddenly we saw planes coming straight towards our house. And Father shouted, "Let's go immediately back to the cellar." And we ran to the cellar, and the bombs dropped on Hiitola.
Eva and her family were among the thousands of Karelians evacuated by the Finnish army. Their homes and barns were burned, food and livestock removed or destroyed to prevent their use by the enemy.
We were very much afraid of being taken to Siberia. Every child knew that Siberia was a threat if we lose the fight. And that was a terrible feeling.
But for Eva, the war truly came home the day her father was called away.
When I woke up that morning, when Father was to leave to the front, I remember that when I opened my eyes, I saw his back bag on the table, and I knew that he was still beside me. That is such a strong memory that I almost feel that I smell his clothes and his nearness. And on the steps, on the kitchen steps, he took me in his arms and said, "Father's girl."
The Soviet invasion was planned as an overwhelming onslaught everywhere at once. President Franklin Roosevelt condemned the attack.
It has invaded a neighbor so infinitesimally small that it could do no conceivable possible harm to the Soviet Union. A small nation that seeks only to live at peace as a democracy, and a liberal, forward-looking democracy at that.
The League of Nations expelled the Soviet Union. But as bombs fell on Finland, the world offered little more. Most judged the odds too nearly impossible. With a few exceptions, Jack Hasey from Bridgewater, Massachusetts had been living the good life in Paris.
I was 22. We're all young enough to want to do something.
Jack and 4 American expatriate friends organized the Iroquois Ambulance Corps and made the fateful decision to ship off to Finland. The Soviets were closing the circle on events that began in 1917, when a revolution swept aside Russia's imperial dynasty. That same year, after 600 years of Swedish domination and 100 years of Russian rule, Finland declared its own independence and established a European-style parliamentary democracy. In 1918, Finnish communists, supported by the Soviet Union, attempted to overthrow that government. They were defeated in a bloody civil war that elevated a Finnish aristocrat, Baron Carl Gustav Mannerheim. A former general in Russia's imperial army, Mannerheim's forces, with support from Germany, crushed the communists.
Mannerheim was a character out of another age. He was tall, he had eyes like gray ice, he looked every inch the field marshal, but there was something almost 18th century about him.
Having served in the Tsarist army before the collapse of the Russian Empire, he also knew the Russian psyche.
He was born of the Swedish-Finnish aristocracy In fact, he did not learn how to speak or read Finnish until he became the commander-in-chief of the Finnish army, and I have heard recordings of Mannerheim's Finnish, and the best that can be said about it is that it's at least better than Winston Churchill's French, but not much.
In the summer of 1939, as the threat of war grew, Mannerheim urged the nation to strengthen its defensive line across the strategic Karelian Isthmus.
And this certainly was one of the factors that saved Finland, because it gave Finland's army about 4 months to get organized, settled, refresher training.
Ja lähdimme silloin Kannakselle 10. päivänä lokakuuta niin kutsuttuun YH:hon. Ja olimme siellä, olimme Kannaksella silloin. Junakuljetuksen aikana olin junakuljetuksen päällikkönä ja Viipurin asemalla minulle toi karjalaisnainen, vanha mummo, toi minulle kukkasen rintaan ja kiitti, että tulimme silloin Kannakselle puolustamaan heitä, jossa ei ollut vielä yhtään mitään sillä kohdalla, missä me taistelimme. Ei taisteluhautoja eikä mitään esteitä, vaan me rakensimme sinne kaivamalla taisteluhaudat ja sitten piikkelankaesteet, teimme korsut.
For decades, Finland's leaders had refused to allocate funds for the nation's defense.
Meillä oli 32 vanhaa Renaulta, ei enää taistelukelpoista, ja 32 Vickersvaunua Englannista, ilman tykkiä, ilman tähystyslaitteita, ilman radioita. Meillä oli 1 vaunu kunnossa.
The Finnish Air Force was equally outdated and under strength.
Mutta ne koneet olivat vanhoja englantilaisia Ripoon koneita, jotka lensivät 160 kilometriä tunnissa, ja venäläisillä oli 370 kilometriä tunnissa kulkevat hävittäjät.
A widespread shortage of ammunition made the situation more grave for the outgunned Finns.
What do you do in a small country where there isn't very much ammunition? You use knives. And already in the Finnish history there has been puukko. And puukko was used for a lot of things, and now it became very handy as a defense mechanism. Because believe me, when you get that under your ribs, it doesn't feel good.
In an often unforgiving climate, Finns fell back to the survival skills they learned as children. It was part of a character quality summed up in the word sisu.
It means that personal kind of ability or spirit that every Finn is supposed to have, that when things go wrong, you don't give up.
In August of 1939, the balance of power in Europe suddenly shifted. Communist Russia and Nazi Germany, mortal ideological enemies, suddenly became allies.
The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was the key that really made the war possible, because it gave Stalin a free hand in those parts of Europe that the treaty allowed him to move into.
On September 1st, Germany invaded Poland from the west, utilizing a new form of warfare called blitzkrieg. On September 17th, Soviet troops launched a similar attack from the east. The two armies met at the Bug River. In October, the Soviets demanded and gained concessions for military bases in Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. Finland's turn came last.
They could see that this was not just a war to change the borders a couple of kilometers. This was a total war where Stalin intended to occupy and dominate Finland.
The Finns refused to accept our conditions, so we were left with no choice but to decide the question by war.
On November 28th, the Soviet Union broke off diplomatic relations. On November 30th, Soviet troops crossed Finland's borders. Finland's entire army, a total of 300,000 soldiers, including reserves, faced the world's largest army of more than 2 million soldiers, with many millions more in reserve. The first week of fighting demonstrated the power of Soviet armor. Finnish troops were pushed back. Shock and fear accompanied retreat and defeat. They searched for a way to beat back Soviet armor.
Our platoon leader informed us we were about to receive secret weapons that could blow up and burn any enemy tank. It did not take long until the promise was fulfilled.
The Molotov cocktail is probably the most famous poor man's weapon system of the 20th century, and it was named after Stalin's foreign minister, Molotov. If you got up behind the tank and dropped a bottle of flaming gasoline into those air ducts, the flaming gasoline would get sucked into the engine, the tank's fuel would blow up, and for the price of a half a gallon of gas, you could destroy an enemy tank.
Toinen oli sitten nämä kasapanokset, ja siinä oli oltava vielä lähempänä, koska se ei ollut sitä pystynyt heittämään oikeastaan paljon 10-15 metriä pitemmän matkaa, että se oli sitten se toinen hurja torjuntakeino. Ja kolmas, jota myöskin käytettiin, jolloin vieläkin hurjemmat miehet täytyy sitten olla sen suorittamassa, pantiin halko.
There was one ski trooper who was decorated for actually immobilizing a Russian tank with a crowbar. He pried the treads off by brute force, whereupon his partner came out with a satchel charge and blew it up.
I was full of fear and full of care because of father who was in the war. And then I felt that I had to be worried all the time because it was like giving strength to our men. We were called home front.
Women had to do all those things what the men used to do when they were at home. So they had to work in the factories. At that time, our country had lots of small farms. If the husband was taken to the front, the woman there had to do all the work. And as also 50,000 horses were taken to the front, which just they couldn't work there without the horses. So from many houses, the horse was taken, so the woman had to work almost as a horse also.
My grandmother and I were part of the women's auxiliary, which was called Lotta Svärd, which is based on a poem during one of the wars that Finns fought. And Lotta Svärd was the name of the woman that took care of the soldiers.
Lotta Svärd organized 100,000 women in defense of their homeland.
The women knitted all kinds of woolen things to the soldiers, those what we call huppu, and where only eyes and the mouth possibly was seen. And then horrible gloves where there was a hole in the place of the first finger, and it was for the rifle, of course.
When the women packed up boxes of food and clothing to send to the soldiers, Eva Kelpi added her own contribution.
I wrote some poems. They were often like some prayers. Oh God, protect us, help us. And then I tried to rhyme them. I must have felt that there's something in the art, that there's some, maybe I'm romanticizing this, no, but I must have felt in the strength of words, even at that time, as a child of 11.
Then there was something which has been done in no other country or war ever. Sometimes the soldier who has been shot or the bomb has killed him, you know how he looked, but the young Lottas washed them First of all, in the Winter War, they had to be melted because they were all frozen, you know. They melted them, they washed them, they put them in a nice, beautiful clothes, and the men then put them in coffins because they were heavy, and then they were sent, all of them, each one, to their home areas. And the young Lottes did this.
Crossing the Taipale River now takes about 10 minutes. The cost is 50 rubles per car. The ferry is a section of an old Red Army pontoon bridge, powered by a recycled engine. In 1939, the river crossing was a killing zone.
This is a place where the Soviet troops get across Taipale and Yoki River and established a bridgehead. When the Soviet engineers established the pontoon bridge, the many casualties were because of Finnish fires. So this bank was full of Soviet engineers' bodies.
Kirill Yakimovich is an engineer from St. Petersburg. He has crossed this river and walked this ground since childhood. He has looked beneath the surface and studied it carefully. Gradually, he learned its awful secrets.
I suppose that the Soviet 105th Rifle Division occupied these dugouts. There are plenty of them here. Dugouts, foxholes, which Soviet soldiers excavated.
They attacked across this open field. It began on December 6th.
They were frontal assaults over and over and over again against the same heavily defended Finnish lines. Entire battalions were wiped out.
By December 17th, 3 Russian divisions had failed to breach Finnish defenses at Taipale.
The Russians went in principally for mass attack, which resulted in the attackers being mown down to the last man by a few well-placed automatic weapons. In spite of this, one attacking wave after another would follow with a similar result.
In some cases, the second, third, fourth wave attacks were actually able to get closer to Finnish lines by taking cover behind their own dead. The temperature was so low that after an hour, a corpse would stop a bullet just as well as a brick wall.
The carnage was too much for some defenders.
There were instances where, for instance, Finnish machine gunners became psychologically unstable because they were called upon to commit this absolutely mindless slaughter day after day after day. They may have hated the Russians for invading their country, but these were not automatons. These were human beings with wives and children, and they were being called to murder hundreds of men a day.
On December 17th, the Soviet offensive shifted to the most strategically important and the most vulnerable sectors of the Mannerheim Line, Suma and Ladi. A breakthrough here would open a gate to the city of Viborg.
One flamethrower tank started to throw flames into the trench at Harkkila strongpoint. Fire from Millionaire bunker and from our infantry prevented the enemy's infantry from getting into our trenches. 2 machine guns fired a total of 40,000 rounds.
Our men held out bitterly in their trenches. There was no panic. Many silent dead littered the ground in front of our positions.
Ja urhoollisia taistelijoita nämä olivat puna-armeijan miehet. Ei siinä mitään, vaikka meidän tulitimme niin paljon kuin pystyimme suomalaisilla konekivääreillä, pikakivääreillä ja kivääreillä, niin juoksivat siinä niin, että piikkilanka-aidoille tulivat ja juoksivat sitten vielä toistensa yli, jotka kuolivat siihen.
The tanks stopped, took casualties, and started to withdraw. This completely demoralized our infantry. The division did not have any success during the day of December 17th, 1939, and after darkness, infantry was withdrawn, having suffered heavy losses.
The battle was stressful, both physically and psychologically. In spite of a whole day of heavy fighting, we were not depressed. The fact that we held on gave us confidence.
That confidence was tested each morning of an unrelenting Soviet offensive.
The enemy's artillery barrage in the morning of December 19th grew to an overwhelming thunder and hit the main defensive line in Summa village the hardest. Our platoon leader gave me responsibility for dealing with the tanks approaching us on the highway. There were no signs of life inside the tank. With our small contribution to the fighting on this day, the hardest of the hardest days was over.
But even harder days would follow.
Tanks again broke through. In the evening, we counterattacked.
Despite all our shortages in equipment, we did the enemy a lot of harm. There were men in our platoon for whom the destruction of tanks was just a regular day's work.
December 21st, 1939. It was Stalin's 60th birthday. His generals had promised Finland as a gift. Instead, they sent back trainloads of dead and wounded, and more bad news from the battlefront.
I saw a field and our dead men lying like heaps of grass during harvest. The next day we did not attack. Our losses were too high and the assault was cancelled.
The offensive against Summa and Taipale during the month of December had decimated 7 Soviet infantry divisions. The remains of 250 tanks littered the battlefield. It was a stunning defensive victory for Finland. Mid-December, winter deepened. Temperatures descended. The winter of 1939 was one of the coldest in recorded history, with temperatures consistently below zero. Temperatures of -40 and 50 Celsius were not uncommon.
Me taistelimme omalla maaperällä omissa olosuhteissa. Jokainen suomalainen osasi hiihtää, osasi toimia metsässä vaikeissa olosuhteissa, myöskin kovassa pakkasessa ja niin edelleen.
The Finns had snow camouflage. The Russians didn't. The Red Army troops stood out like proverbial sore thumbs. You couldn't miss them. As often as possible, the Finns tried to rotate their men so that the frontline troops at least got a few hours of warmth, a chance to have a hot meal. If you're going to fight in that kind of an environment, you have to provide a diet that's extremely rich in protein and fats. The Finns were able to do that. The Russians were, black bread and tea. At 40 below zero, a hot meal is the difference between life and death.
In mid-December, cold and hunger were the decisive factors in a battle Finns called the Sausage War. Marching through snow and ice, a Russian battalion slipped deep behind Finnish lines.
All of a sudden, this Russian raiding force erupts in the rear area. This was the Russians' big chance. They had broken through, they were behind Finnish lines. If they had just kept going, they would have cracked the whole Finnish defense line. But what stopped them was the field kitchens. The Finnish cooks had just put on enough sausage soup to feed the entire 2,000 men in that sector. When they got a whiff of the sausage soup, it completely took the wind out of the raid. Ignoring their officers, the Russians immediately went for the field kitchens.
Me jouduttiin siihen meidänkin komppaniudit keskelle sitä makkarakapinaa. Ja pimeä yö oli ja aina ammuttiin sinne, missä vaan leimatti. Ja sinne päin ammuttiin, ei nähnyt pimeässä mitään tähdetä.
And that's what gave the Finns time to regroup, counterattack, and virtually wipe them out.
Markers in the village churchyard honor the defenders of the Battle of Suomussalmi. Memorials on the Rata Road honor another part of the story, the elite 44th Ukrainian Division. When the 44th Division crossed into Finland, they brought along a marching band and their dress uniforms. They expected a victory parade at the end of their mission.
We can see all those stones, nearly 20,000 stones, and you can visualize that every stone is one man and he had had a wife and children. Then you can imagine how much sorrow it has caused.
The 44th Division crossed into Finland on the Rata Road in mid-December. They had been sent to relieve the beleaguered 163rd Division, pinned down on roads around Suomussalmi, by meager yet persistent Finnish resistance. They were then to slice across Finland and cut the country in half.
These were mechanized Soviet divisions, but the roads they were able to use, these were logging tracks. They were 1 lane wide, they were solid ice, and once the Russian columns were committed to that territory, they had to stay on the roads.
The combined forces of the 163rd and 44th Divisions totaled almost 30,000 soldiers, 335 artillery pieces, more than 100 tanks and 50 armored cars. Stretched out for 20 to 30 miles, their columns resembled huge snakes.
They would attack and try and knock out vehicles on the road in the front and vehicles at the end, so that the vehicles in between would then become stuck.
The Finns were on skis, and they could move very swiftly up and down the length of that column, and they were completely invisible. A barrage of mortar fire, hand grenades, and the ski troopers would surge out of the forest and cut the road. And then disappear on the other side of the road. And after them would come combat engineers who would widen the breach and fortify it to cut off one segment of the Russian column from the other.
They would isolate the units and cut them into what they called mottis, and motti is a measure of wood in Finland. When you chop wood and you stack it up, that's one measure of wood. And that's what they did. They chopped up these divisions.
Once these Soviet columns were chopped into mottis, they were pinned down by snipers. The cold was so intense at Suomussalmi that the instant a man was hit by a bullet and his circulation slowed, his body froze in the posture that he was standing in when he was hit.
Men are exhausted and starved. We have about 400 wounded, no petrol. Most of the horses are killed. We are almost out of ammo. Enemy is attacking us from the front. Some commanders are deserting from the battlefield. I request urgent help.
There would be no help for the 44th Division. Survivors huddled in underground dugouts against intense cold, extreme hunger, and enemy fire. One by one, they were hunted down. 1,500 Soviets were taken as prisoners of war. Captured tanks, trucks, guns, and ammunition helped replenish Finland's arsenal. Only 5,000 escaped across the border. Among them was Alexei Vinogradov, commander of the 44th Division, and his 2 top officers. They were arrested, court-martialed, and placed before a firing squad.
Suomussalmi is where the Finns scored their greatest triumph with Monty tactics.
Moti tactics, repeated all along Finland's northern front, stopped the Soviet offenses. Some Red Army units held out until the end of the war. None survived the Lemeti Moti.
mutta se tuntui vaan hirveälle, kun siellä oli paljon venäläisillä hevosia ja niillä oli niin nälkä, että ne oli syönyt kaikki ne hevosen luut. Pakkasella oli jyrsytty ja nahat oli kaviojuuria myöti hampaan jäljet, mitkä oli pakkasella syöty, että oli pientäkin rasvaa saatu.
Finland's victories made headlines around the world. 8,000 Swedes plus 800 Norwegians and Danes volunteered their services. Fundraisers were held in the United States. Supplies and equipment were donated. 350 Finnish-American volunteers sailed out of New York. At the beginning of January, after 1 month of travel, American Jack Hasey and his Iroquois Ambulance Corps volunteers finally arrived in Finland. They were immediately sent north, deep into the forests. As he and his ambulance crew picked up the wounded and transported them to field hospitals, they were in constant danger from enemy attack and from crossfire. One day, Jack's buddy nailed a sign to a tree. When he brought wounded Russians to the hospital, he saw the ferocity of feelings.
Ruskies, Ruskies, Ruskies. They hated the Russians.
He witnessed Finnish ski commandos with a more lethal form of expression. Hasey describes their handiwork in his memoir. It has become a legend of the Winter War.
A weird scene in still life. A Russian patrol standing by the side of the road, the men upright and frozen stiff in the snow, a Russian officer beside them, pistol in hand. All had had their throats cut. The officer's pistol was loaded, and not a shot had been fired.
Jack's group became known as the Lost Yankee Battalion. An American reporter tracked them down and filmed them for a newsreel that played in movie theaters across the United States. In January, sporadic fighting continued on all fronts, but after 1 full month of war, major operations by the Red Army ceased.
January was largely a lull. Both sides were regrouping. It was a time of taking stock.
The enemy's attacks in December could be compared with a badly conducted orchestra, in which the instruments were played out of time. Division after division was thrown against our positions, but the cooperation between the different arms remained bad.
In the 1930s, Stalin conducted a campaign of terror against perceived enemies of the state. It would consume the professional officer corps of the Red Army. Thousands of officers were arrested and executed, including 90% of its generals and 80% of its colonels. They were replaced with less experienced soldiers, along with a cadre of political officers. But real power was in the hands of the NKVD, a secret internal security force that reported directly to Stalin himself.
They interfered with everything, and they had the right and the authority to go in anywhere and to take very drastic measures like shooting the general, shooting anyone.
Soviet state military archives document the fate of the 76th Tank Battalion, 34th Light Tank Brigade, trapped within a moti at Lemete. In January of 1940, Battalion Commander Captain Ryazanov began to plan a breakout. But the battalion's NKVD officer opposed it. He called Ryazanov a coward. Ryazanov replied, "I am in charge. I give the orders." Only 19 men of that battalion survived the war.
For Stalin, the situation was desperate because he was worried about Hitler, even despite the treaty. He had to somehow knock the Finns out of the war.
Stalin brings in General Timoshenko, who was one of the few really good professional Red Army soldiers who had escaped the purges.
Timoshenko augmented his forces for a massive new offensive with 45 divisions, 750,000 soldiers. more than 3,000 artillery pieces, 2,000 tanks, and hundreds of fighters and bombers.
And he adjusted the strategy. Now he concentrated all the forces against the key to Finland, which was in southern Finland, the Karelian Isthmus.
Field Marshal Mannerheim monitored the Soviet buildup and understood the inevitable. As he committed the last of his reserves, Mannerheim drew confidence from the fundamental strength of his nation.
The nation stood as one man behind their armed forces in the calm and determined knowledge that the struggle must go on.
On February 1st, the Soviets resumed their offensive. Up to 2,000 artillery shells hit the Mannerheim line each day for the next 10 days.
Niin kuin helvetti ei, niin en ole käynyt tietenkään siellä, mutta tuntuu siltä, että ei sen kamalampaa tilannetta voi olla.
On February 11th, up to 250,000 shells rained down on the line. It was the largest artillery barrage since the Battle of Verdun during the First World War.
8:35. An unprecedented artillery bombardment of our entire sector. 12:15. Tanks have broken through. Enemy infantry has captured part of our positions.
All Finnish reserves were thrown into battle. The Red Army could not be contained.
By the end of February 13th, on the third day of the offensive, the 123rd Rifle Division with attached armor units broke through the main defensive line. Sumo fortified area was completely destroyed.
At the end of February, Jack Hazy's work as an ambulance driver came to a sudden end. The next day, he was evacuated from the front line. At the end of February, Finnish defenders had been pushed back to a line in front of the strategic city of Viborg, headquarters for the Finnish forces on the Karelian Isthmus. Finnish defenders struggled to hold the line in front of Viborg. On March 5th, Soviet troops attempted a flanking maneuver across the frozen Gulf of Finland to surround the city of Viborg. When Finns detected columns of tanks and infantry on the ice, they fired their huge coastal batteries, 12-inch guns, intended to sink battleships.
The weight and velocity of the projectiles was so enormous that it shattered the Gulf ice and opened up yawning gaps, and whole Russian companies disappeared through these holes in the ice.
The Finns' desperate resistance continued with a ferocity that masked a steadily diminishing capacity. By March 12th, they had almost no more ammunition. At noon on March 13th, the word spread along the line. An armistice had been signed. The brutal 105-day war was over.
If a fly had been in the air, he would have held its buzz. Not a single shot. Dead silence. I did not believe such a thing was possible. Then, people started to regain their senses. Started throwing hats and all kinds of stuff in the air. Almost nothing remained of our battalion. Front line is front line. All I felt was indifference. What do I remember most from that war? It was the incompetence of our army. It could not even deal with a handful of Finns. They showed us how to fight a war.
Gunnar Latio, leading a column back toward Finland's newly negotiated border, decided to stop to check on his men.
Lähdin hiihtämään sitä taaksepäin ja pysähdyin yhden tien vieden vähälle korkeammalle penkalle ja pistin suksen sauvat kainaloihin ja jäin katselemaan siinä poikia, kun heilautiin kättä varmaan heille siinä, kun partaalina meni ohitte. Ja sitten minä nukahdin.
That's where his men found him. Latio remembers his dream. He was in a hospital. They were offering him a bed. 24 hours later, he woke up in a hospital bed.
Ja olen onnellinen siitä, että sota päättyi sillä tavalla ja sillä hetkellä, sillä me olimme kaikki niin loppuun ajettuja kuin ikinä voi olla.
Our company commander told us, the war is over. After that, he met a Finnish company commander in no man's land. In the evening, everyone started campfires. Our campfires were far from the Finnish ones. Everyone was drunk and our company commander was rebuking us. Our soldiers told him, "Who needs this war? Do Finns need this war? No one needs it, neither us nor Finns." Everyone was singing songs. I made myself warm at the fire. That was it. The war was over.
Jack Hazy was on a ship in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, returning to the United States when he learned about the ceasefire. More than 6 decades later, after a career in the French Foreign Legion and the CIA, Jack Hazy was presented with Finland's highest honor, the Liberty Cross. The peace terms announced were harsh. All of Eastern Karelia, about 12% of Finland, became part of the Soviet Union. Anna Tukia was nursing wounded soldiers.
Ja sitten meni oikein tuskainen nuori mies, opiskelijapoika kai oli se, ja häneltä oli amputoitu siis toinen jalka pois. Ja se siellä hyvin tuskaisena siitä se sanoi mulle, sitä varten kun minä sen jalkani sinne kannaksella jättäin, sitä ryssäsen sais, ja musta kun säilyisi meillä vapaus.
Tommy Lainonen was one of thousands of Karelians who had been forced from their homes by the war.
Ukki rupesi ihan ääneen itkemään. Ja me itkin ja me lähdettiin sinne. Se on sodan viimeinen rauhan ehdot luettiin, jotta me karjalaiset jäädään tänne.
I didn't cry when everybody else cried. I used to go into the woods and cry alone. And that I have done many times because of the loss of Karelia, the loss of home, and because of homesickness too. And that was the day when homesickness made a nest in me, and it has not disappeared.
In the next few days, 422,000 Finnish Karelians refused to become Soviet citizens by leaving their homes and most of their possessions behind and crossing the new border into Finland.
Refugees everywhere, families trying to cram several generations worth of precious family belongings into one wagon or one sled.
We had 3 days to get our things from Hiitola, and my mother and my grandmother went to traveled to Hiitola, and my mother and father met in the middle of night under a starry sky there on the yard of the home.
As winter turned to spring, Finns were left with a final unpleasant responsibility. In Suomussalmi, along 20 kilometers of the Rata Road, melting snow and ice revealed the bodies of thousands of Soviet soldiers.
In spring 1940, the Finnish soldiers buried these died Russian soldiers and also horses because the summer was coming on. And it was very difficult to walk around this area in 1940 in summertime because there were a lot of flies and the smell was very bad in this area.
Raino Korti was a 21-year-old soldier then, assigned to a burial detail.
Se olisi tuntunut hyvin niin vaikealle, jos ne olisi ollut omia, eikä hän olisi pantukaan sinne. Mutta kun se on vihollinen ihminen. Sitä ei kunnioiteta sitä vihollista, olkoon se elävänä tai kuolleena.
Nor did Soviet leaders honor them.
Only 350 bodies were sent to the Russian side because Russia won this war, and they said that only 350 soldiers died here, and they took all those bodies with them.
The rest are still buried in mass graves on the Rata Road, unidentified by the nation that sent them into battle. When Nikita Khrushchev took over as leader of the Soviet Union after Stalin's death, he began a realistic accounting of Soviet casualties. He claimed as many as 1 million Soviet soldiers were lost in the 3 months of the Winter War. Since then, some historians have disputed Khrushchev's numbers. Few have challenged his conclusion the Winter War had unintended consequences.
A victory at such a cost was actually a moral defeat. Our people never knew we had suffered a moral defeat because they never told the truth. All of us, and Stalin first and foremost, sensed in our victory a defeat by the Finns. It was a dangerous defeat because it encouraged our enemy's conviction that the Soviet Union was a colossus with feet of clay. In short, our miserable conduct of the Finnish campaign encouraged Hitler in his plans for the Blitzkrieg, his Operation Barbarossa.
Stalin's perception of the threat to Leningrad turned out to be completely in the wrong direction, because when the threat came, it was from the Wehrmacht divisions pushing up through Poland and the Baltic states rather than from the Finns.
It's quite possible that had Stalin not had the lessons of the Winter War, that his army would have been even in poorer shape when Hitler attacked, and that Hitler actually might have managed to take Moscow.
Since the collapse of the Soviet Union, there has been a re-examination of this cataclysmic conflict.
It was in 1988 when the Russians said that they start the Winter War. And before that, they said that the Finns started the Winter War. Most Russian people don't know anything about Winter War. They have white pages on their history.
More than 6 decades later, even after the fall of the Soviet Union, when all the occupied Baltic nations have regained their independence, Eastern Karelia and its former capital Vyborg remain part of Russia.
I'm waiting for Karelia to be returned to us so that I could take my grandchildren there and show that this is my original home district. And it has belonged to the neighbor for some time, but now it's again ours. And that is what I'm waiting for.
The Winter War shaped the thoughts of those who experienced it and those who have studied it.
Don't rely too much on technology. Technology is important, material strength is important, but skill, how you use your equipment is even more important, and ultimately will. If you don't have the will to fight, nothing else matters.
The people of Finland have shown that a united nation, small though it may be, can develop unprecedented fighting power and thus withstand the most formidable ordeals that destiny brings. By closing ranks at the moment of peril, the people of Finland earned for themselves the right to continue to live their own independent lives within the family of free peoples.
Finland won. Because had Finland lost, she would have been occupied by the Soviets, and she would have been like Estonia, which actually gave way to Stalin's demands and was occupied. And so in this sense, Finland won, obviously.
Nature has tried, but cannot conceal the old battlefields, the anti-tank traps, the blasted bunkers, unexploded shells, the unburied human remains. On the old battlefields, a new generation of Russians and Finns meet, not to renew a war, but to remember, reliving the past, shaping the future.